I had a request from people that they wanted to see one of our cats. You say hello, Mo? Mo, you say hello? Mo? Mo? You say hello? Ah! You say hello? Hi? I'll let you look at Mo there. So we left off talking about identity politics, part of a larger point of how the new evangelical movement of the 1950s ended up as this political movement known as the religious right, kind of the Protestant wing of the Republican Party and the Protestant wing of the new right that we've been talking about in Lecture 11. But if we ended the story there in terms of Christian political influence, we'd only be getting about half the story, because we need to understand the ways in which Christians have sought to provide an answer to the crisis of leadership, not just in terms of politics, not just a political answer to the crisis of leadership, but also a cultural answer as well too. They try to provide a cultural leadership, if you will, as well. And this began in some ways during the Jesus movement and continued after that time. We need to understand the ways in which what we consider to be the religious right is the political wing of a Christian countercultural movement, a culture within a culture, if you will. Sorry, my cat Mo is very needy right now. But this Christian counterculture is advancing in many ways at the same time as the religious right is advancing. This Christian counterculture is advancing in some ways by the same people, and that brings us to the story of Scaremare. So it's 1979 in Virginia at Liberty University. This is Jerry Falwell's university. He is going to be launching Scaremare. He's going to be, getting ahead. Mo, this cat. At the same time, he's launching the moral majority of this kind of political engagement with American culture. His church and the university are going to do something that they hadn't done before. In 1979, they're going to celebrate Halloween. Christians celebrating Halloween. Christians don't celebrate Halloween. Halloween is Satan's yearly kegger. This is the time that Christians are supposed to run and hide. I don't know how many of you participated in trick-or-treating or Halloween. I don't know if Halloween was a time you looked forward to, a time that you were kind of bummed out by. For me, I never went trick-or-treating. Halloween was a reminder of that I didn't fit in. Halloween, for fundamentalist Christians, you were supposed to sit and read your Bible and pray for all your friends who are out trick-or-treating. So I never went trick-or-treating or anything like that. When I got older, I egged people's houses. We did the trick stuff, but let's not get into that too much. Falwell and his church decides, as a part of their shift towards cultural engagement, right? As I said, you might be confused from an earlier lecture. I called Jerry Falwell a fundamentalist. One of the things that's happening in the 70s are evangelicals and fundamentalists having divided over this issue of cultural engagement versus disengagement are beginning to find themselves in the late 70s and 80s. And so you find fundamentalists doing things that they had not previously done. In this particular case, you have Falwell and his church and his university celebrating Halloween. But they're going to do it in a Christian way. they're going to develop a Christian haunted house that they call Scaremare. Scaremare actually developed out of a Texas Christian church in 1972. Falwell kind of brings us over to Virginia, and he and his school are going to put on a Christian haunted house. Maybe some of you have been to a Christian haunted house. These things are so they're around enough. They've been around enough, and there's enough of them that people even write dissertations on these now. They're called hell houses. You can read dissertations on America's hell houses. Scaremare is one of the great ones of them. What is a Christian haunted house? In absence of us being able to kind of share our experiences with Christian haunted houses or Christian hell houses, let me play a little video for you from Jerry Falwell's Scaremare from last year.
This is the tale of Scaremare. Do you think we lost him?
Let's not find out. I can hear it. Okay, well, there's just no way that's true.
Yeah, dude, that's pretty unbelievable.
Oh, but it's true. And those kids, they were never seen again. And the creatures, they're still out here on this property.
Oh my word, no, thank you. Wow. So, yeah, that's Scaremare. It's kind of evolved over the years as Christian haunted houses have. I mean, what students have told me in the past, some of them, they take you like down into the basement, and that's hell, and so you see all these horrific scenes, and then they take you up to heaven in the attic, and you see like what life could be after, and they take a lot of different forms. I think the original Scaremare had people would walk through the different rooms and witness pretty intense scenes of death and violence. You might walk into one room of the original Scaremare and see like a plane crash, with bodies and blood strewn about, and go into the next room, and a wife has killed her children and a husband and killed herself, and this is pretty awful stuff. However, the story, ends up, or whatever the experience is, the story is all the same at the end. You're going to at some point get a gospel presentation. And in 1979, if you went through this house of horrific scenes of violence in Scaremare, you would get a 5-minute gospel sermon from one of Jerry Falwell's pastors about why you should be born again, because you don't want to, you never know when you're going to end up dead in one of these kinds of ways. And so you want to make sure that when you do die in one of these horrific scenes of tragic violence, that you're going to go to heaven. If you guys want to play a practical joke on me, if any of you guys know Ruben Galang, he actually, I forget whether he participated in a Scaremare or he was at Liberty, so he knows about Scaremare. So if you know Ruben, send him emails or texts and say, hey man, you want to go to a hell house? And we'll see how he responds to that. But let's play this little joke if you know Ruben. what is the Hell House? What is the Christian haunted house? This is Jesus and Jason Voorhees getting together to bring in the sheaves. If you don't know who Jason Voorhees is, that's okay. Don't look him up. Scaramare was an attempt to Christianize America's fascination with violence. The late 70s, early 80s was the heyday of the slasher film, the Halloween series, the Friday the 13th series. And Scaramare is the Christian alternative, the Christian engagement with America's fascination with slasher supernatural violence. It's using this fear / fascination to try to spread the gospel, to try to bring Christians to bring Christians in through this particular kind of way. I don't know if you've been to a Hell House. I don't know after you've seen the video if you want to go to a Hell House in the future, but some questions for you to be thinking about as we continue through this lecture today. One, is this the way that Christians want to go about making a difference in the world? Is this how Christians want to be remembered? Through offering Americans a Christian alternative to slasher violence, the Christian haunted house. I know some of you guys are probably more familiar with the trunk or treats and a little more sanitary version, but there are the hell houses out there. Is this how Christians want to go about making a difference in the world? Is this even how we want to go about evangelizing? Maybe some of you have partaken in either, or maybe been subject to this kind of maybe guerrilla warfare evangelism, where you could imagine somebody being invited to a Christian haunted house, but not being told that it's a Christian haunted house. Hey, come to this haunted house with me. And you invite your unsaved, quote unquote, unsaved friends out, and you don't really tell them what exactly, or you weren't told yourself what exactly to expect, that you're going to get a gospel message at the end. Is this kind of backdoor guerrilla warfare, sideways evangelism the best way to go about spreading the gospel? Something for you to consider. The other question is, what are the effects of this kind of Christian counterculturalism on the Christian community itself? And here's where we need to come back to Scaramare. And the original Scaramare, let me say this. Falwell used real bodies in his hell houses. No, he didn't go to the morgue and like dig up body parts and things like that. No, his youth group got to dress up and act in all these scenes, and pour fake blood on themselves and pretend to be dead. And think about this from the standpoint of the kids themselves, right? You hated Halloween because Halloween was a time in which you were reminded that you were an outsider, that you didn't belong. Your friends all got to go out and trick or treat and dress up and have a good time, and you had to stay home and read your Bible. Now you get to participate in Halloween, but you don't have to feel bad about participating in Halloween because you're doing it for Jesus. You're doing it as a missions attempt even. You're doing it as an effort to spread the gospel, but you get to participate in Halloween too in cool ways, like putting blood on yourself, and all the way up to the Pennywise makeup, I guess, of Scaramare 2018. This is pretty cool, right? You get to have your evangelical cake and eat it too. You can participate in Halloween now, but not feel bad about it. But we do have to wonder: is this strategy of cultural engagement, as much as it's intended to transform American culture, in this case, transform America's fascination with violence into a concern for being born again, is this countercultural strategy ultimately a gateway for Christians and conservative Christians to become part of the American mainstream. In the same way that we saw the hippie of the 1960s in some way become the hipster of the present, a consumer phenomenon that was supports American capitalism as much as it really runs counter to it. To what extent does this Christian cultural engagement ultimately leave the door open for particularly young Christians to ultimately leave the Christian counterculture? I mean, how many of those kids who dressed up for Halloween as a part of Scaremare or some other hell house, eventually down the road said, what's the big deal with going out trick-or-treating with my friends? Maybe this year I think I'll sit out Scaremare, but I've been dressing up the last couple of years. Why not go out and dress up and go out with my friends? And, if I'm around them, then I can evangelize, right? I can go out and trick-or-treat and I can evangelize my friends while I'm doing so. Because as we all know, trick-or-treating with friends is really the best opportunity to have a serious conversation about Jesus, right? These are kind of like, I don't know, that probably Spring Harbor doesn't have it, given our concept. We don't have any bar ministers on campus. I went to a state school, so our Christian fellowship, we had all kinds of bar ministers, meaning individuals who would go out drinking with their friends on the weekend at bars, and their justification was, well, if I'm with them, I can be this good Christian influence to them. I have an opportunity to share the gospel with my own saved friends, to which we would always say, yeah, really, man, is the bar on a Friday or Saturday night really the best place to share the gospel? But these are the kinds of rationalizations that a strategy of Christian countercultural engagement can lead people into. Right? You can justify any kind of worldliness under, well, I'm doing it for Jesus. And Christians do this all the time today. They justify all kinds of worldly behavior on the basis that maybe even the self-deception that they're doing it for Jesus. And to what extent does this countercultural strategy of the new evangelicals, the Jesus movement, leading into things like Christian hell houses, to what extent does this encourage Christians to deceive themselves about their own worldliness? Again, these are questions for you to consider as we wrap up this course. Not this lecture, we got a long way to go, but wrap up this course. These are the things I would hope you would be thinking about as you think about Christian critical participation in the world. How have Christians in the past or even in the present, how are they doing so, and how do you want to fit in with that or maybe move in a different direction? Well, it's not just the Christian haunted houses. It's in many ways the countercultural products that began flooding out of fundamentalist and new evangelical circles in the 1980s. None more prolific, none more successful probably than the Left Behind series. Any of you watched read a Left Behind novel? I know they're becoming less common literature now for Christians. Maybe you've seen the Left Behind movie. I'm sure none of you have played the Left Behind video games, but yes, there are Left Behind video games. One of the major ways in which countercultures looked to influence the dominant culture is through the products that they develop. In the 60s, the counterculture, it was the organic foods, it was the tie-dye shirts, it was the peace signs, it was the Bob Dylan and Janis Joplin records, right? These are all products. These products that countercultures develop serve really two purposes. One is to influence the mainstream culture, but probably even more commonly, these products are developed to try to keep people in the Christian fold, to provide resources for the counterculture to sustain the counterculture itself. And Left Behind certainly serves both of those purposes. Most Left Behind products, video games, movies were intended for consumption by Christians themselves in order to maintain the conservative evangelical / fundamentalist worldview of a world that's getting worse and worse and worse until ultimately the rapture and the period of tribulation. On the other hand, these Left Behind novels were also considered to be in some ways survival guides, right? These Left Behind novels in many ways were intended to be left behind for those people who had to live after the rapture. And they were asking themselves, what just happened? Why did this happen? Well, they would find these Left Behind novels in which they'd open up and they would find out, I have been left behind. What should I do now? And these Left Behind novels were kind of like how to do tribulation for dummies, if you will. So they were for consumption by the Christian community, providing them with a safe form of apocalyptic entertainment, right? I mean, Americans, just like they love the slasher films, they love the apocalyptic films. They love the end of the world kinds of films. Left Behind provided a source of entertainment, apocalyptic entertainment for Christians, but an apocalyptic entertainment that they knew was safe, was family friendly, and one that they could even use as a tool of evangelism. So how many people bought Left Behind novels not just for their kids to read to reinforce the rapture culture worldview, but bought these novels as presents for their non-believing friends in an effort to try to, almost like a gospel tract. And the truth is, I have been in church services where people have said, the reason they came to Christ is because they read a Left Behind novel. So I don't want to completely kind of knock this as an evangelistic strategy, but I do want you to understand how these things work and function, providing entertainment, safe entertainment for Christians themselves, but also providing used as tools of evangelism too. Before we leave this, it's important to understand the way that these Christian cultural products also serve political purposes too, right? If you read the Left Behind novels, you know that they are very worried about the formation of a one world government. In fact, the bad guys of the Left Behind series are known as global community, into which many people in the world would say global community. Well, that sounds like a good thing, right? Everyone getting along, not in the fundamentalist timeline. The fundamentalist timeline is there's going to be a one world government established. And who's going to head up that one world government? Well, the Antichrist. And so evangelical fundamentalists throughout the 20th century, evangelicals for a lot of that time too, have been pretty staunchly anti-UN, anti-US, joining in international organizations, international treaties, whether that's issues of war crimes, whether it's issue of climate change. Christians have strongly encouraged the United States to not join in international agreements, and a lot of that stems from this rapture, from this premillennial dispensationalist worldview that if the United States lends itself towards establishing international cooperation, that global community will develop. And the United Nations will become a one world government, and Antichrist will ultimately come through there. So it's this kind of weird dynamic. On one hand, you would think that if you believe that, all these things are going to happen, rapture, tribulation, millennium, all these things are just going to happen, irrespective of human activity, you would think you would want to encourage it. Let's get it over with. Let's get the rapture and tribulation. Let's get it over with now. But But politically, fundamentalism and evangelicalism have lent themselves towards a pretty staunchly anti-internationalist, anti-UN, a strong Christian nationalist bent. America should go it alone. Maybe you've heard the words "America First" issued before too. So Left Behind's political legacy has been a pretty interesting one. But as I've kind of hinted at, in some ways, not just the country, but in some ways the Christian counterculture itself has left the Left Behind series behind. I think you can, I think a student joked, if you want to get a Left Behind book, just go to a thrift store, right? You're not going to find these on bookshelves anymore. You can find them at thrift secondhand stores. And in many ways, the Christian counterculture itself, which through the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s was sustained by these Christian bookstores, they're increasingly fewer and far between. They're harder to find. Does that mean the Christian counterculture is dissolved, or does it mean that the Christian counterculture has mainstreamed? All the things that you used to be able to get in a so Lifeway, was that one of the Grand Rapids bookstores? I mean, there's still some around, right? It's an incredible Christian bookstore up in Grand Rapids, the Baker one. I went there over spring break for the first time. The place is pretty great. But for the most part, these things are on their way out. And is it because you can get all these Christian cultural products now online through Amazon, through mainstream stores like Hobby Lobby and Walmart? Is the counterculture, the Christian counterculture, which was more distinctive in my youth, has that become more mainstream now? And so there's a lot more of a melding of mainstream American culture and the Christian counterculture itself. In some ways, the best way to answer that would be to talk about what exactly is the status of Christian music today. And don't start writing all these terms down. I'm not going to really talk about them, but I didn't want to mess with these slides too much at this point. But in some ways, gauging this question of how distinctive of a counterculture is evangelical Christianity in the United States today versus how much has evangelical Christianity kind of become part of the mainstream culture. Now, politically speaking, we know that conservative evangelicalism and republicanism they're pretty much the same thing now. There's very little differences between those two. Evangelical Christians almost universally support. In fact, white evangelical Christians are in fact the most reliable supporters of Republican stances. So we know that Christian politics has really merged into mainstream Republican politics. To what extent has the Christian counterculture, which has sustained those Christian politics, to what extent has the Christian counterculture itself kind of dissolved into the mainstream culture? In some ways, the best way to answer that question is to talk about the status of Christian contemporary music. One of the lasting contributions of the Jesus movement was a reconciliation of Christianity, conservative Christianity, and contemporary forms of music. That was rock and roll and folk music and acid rock and what have you in the 60s, to distinctive Christian music alternatives to all the major genres of the 80s and 90s, right? If there was heavy metal music in the 1980s, there was Christian heavy metal music. I don't know. Maybe you guys should listen to some Stryper if you're bored today. If ska music was popular, well, there were Christians producing ska music. Pretty much Christians replicating any form of popular music in the 80s and 90s. To what extent is there a distinctive Christian contemporary music now? Obviously, there's still Christian radio, as Spring Arbor should know pretty well. Clearly, there's still a pretty strong worship music industry. Is there still Christian contemporary music that is very distinctive from mainstream music, or have those two kind of melded in some kind of way? To give you to give you a chance to talk about this, I usually set aside about a half hour of class when we would have face-to-face time. You set aside about a half hour of class just to have an open discussion about the status of Christian contemporary music today. We can't do that live, but we can still have that discussion. So if you go on Blackboard under the discussion board, I'll put instructions up there, and you have a 5-point extra credit opportunity there to kind of respond to the questions there, maybe talk about who your favorite Christian artists are today, and just to weigh in on the place of Christian music. So if you're really into to music, you're really into Christian music, if you really have strong opinions about this, I'm going to give you a chance to have some outlet there. I just want to highlight, as a historian, just to give you a sense of heritage, if you will, the Christian contemporary music, like all forms of music, they want to identify like who started that, who was the first. And if most people consider Christian contemporary music, the father of Christian contemporary music, to be Larry Norman. Larry Norman was and that was the guy in the very beginning of this lecture, in the middle of the screen. If you're wondering what that guy was doing alongside of a guy in the middle there, the long-haired guy alongside Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell and me, apparently, that's Larry Norman. Larry Norman was a member of the rock band People. Norman found Jesus in the late 60s and wondered if he could keep, he loved music, but he wondered if he could keep playing it if he was a Christian, because he was hearing from a lot of pastors that rock and roll was the devil's music. So Larry really struggled with this. He would spend some time in Switzerland, actually with Francis Schaeffer, and I asked Schaeffer this question: Can Christians rock and roll? And Schaeffer's like, well, of course Christians can rock and roll. The idea that music is somehow inherently good or bad. Music is just music. And so if you want to rock out for Jesus, rock out for Jesus. Norman would provide, and so Norman, he first tried to do this to his rock band People, but eventually left People because he wanted to make a much more distinctive, a much more hard-hitting Christian contemporary music. Norman would give Christian contemporary music in some ways its best justification in his song, "Why Should the Devil Have All the Good Music?" Isn't that the answer to can Christians listen to rock and roll? Isn't that kind of the answer summed up right there? Why should the devil have all the good music? But I don't want to play that song for you because it's frankly kind of hokey. Your Larry Norman education is going to run through his song about Elvis. And I love this song because in many ways Larry Norman is the king of Christian contemporary music. Almost every Christian artist today would at some point grew up listening to Larry Norman and would claim Norman as an influence on them. Elvis is largely recognized as the king of rock and roll. What you have in Larry Norman's song, "Elvis Has Left the Building," is the king of Christian contemporary music taking down the king of rock and roll. So enjoy, if you will, or if you don't want to, skip over it. But if you skip over it, you probably will go to a special place in hell. So don't skip over it. Listen to Larry Norman in his song, "Elvis Has Left the Building."
Lean not on your own understanding, but lay your burdens down. Lean not on the gates of Graceland, that dream's buried in the ground. your money, not bothered by your drugs. You dress like Liberace and your boys, they dress like thugs. I don't care about the women, you were an outlaw on the run. But at the end, were you man enough to repent from all you've done? Yeah. Elvis, I know where you are. You're sleeping in the ground. Will you rise and stand up when the Son of Man comes down? You sang a lot of gospel songs and you knew about the light. I hope you reached out at the end and this time held on tight. Elvis, you've left the building, but God is in the house. I wonder what you said with your last breath. Your girlfriend says you cried out, God help me, God. When comes the resurrection, will you waken from your death? Some sign up at the 11th hour, some work right from the start. God knows how trapped we can become in the darkness of the heart. And that's why he gave us Jesus to die upon that tree. For those of us so snared by sin might someday be set free. Elvis, you left the building, but God's still in the house. I wonder what you said with your last breath. Your girlfriend says you cried out, God help me, God. When comes the resurrection, will you waken from your death? Elvis, you've left the building, but God's still in the house. I wonder what you said with your last breath. Your girlfriend says you cried out, God help me, God. When comes the resurrection, will you waken from your death?
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if I've converted any of you over to Larry Norman, but have a sense of the history of the Christian music that you enjoy today, where that comes from artists like Larry Norman. I'm not a very big Larry Norman fan. It's not really my generation or style of music. I came to Christianity and Christian music in the 1990s, and so it's bands like the 77s and the Choir and Lifesavers Underground and Michael Knott that are kind of the Christian music that I grew up with, I guess. You guys probably haven't heard of those, and so that's why we'll provide an opportunity to talk a little bit more about the state of Christian music and what that says about is there still a Christian counterculture today? To what extent has the Christian counterculture been mainstream? We can talk about that for those of you who want some extra credit points. Kind of our final subject is how the Christian counterculture, whether through whether through evangelistic strategies like Scaremare, or through things like Left Behind, and Left Behind in the Christian contemporary music, what kind of influence that's had on the United States. I think for good and ill, you can sum up the kind of cultural influence of, right? Because as we've seen with these different movements, right? For instance, women's liberation's influence on America wasn't always just all in like political developments, right? It was all kinds of cultural changes too. Well, that's just the case too with the Christian counterculture. It's not just the religious right and the political influence of Christians, but it's also the cultural influence that they've waged. This cultural influence, I think, can best be summarized by the term moral sloganism. That Christian groups developed slogans that have had a pretty significant influence on American political and cultural life. We'll look at just two slogans. One, the family values slogan. Family values was a term that Moral Majority introduced into the American lexicon in the 1980s, and it's even though we don't today use that specific term, family values, it's a little antiquated. What it symbolizes is the centrality of the American family, or the centrality of the family for not just the Christian but the national experiences, has really only grown since the 1980s. And so a concern for family is significant. Some Christian groups, in trying to kind of stake out the Christian message, have gone so far as to say that the family is defined in Scripture is just as important as holding to the biblical family is just as important as holding to the gospel itself. They've gone that far. So it's not just that family has the idea of family has grown in esteem within Christian circles since the 1980s, but really the influence of family values, the family values slogan, has had a significant influence on our politics, right? I mean, the use, the hanging of strategies, political legislation around the idea of family has only grown since the 1980s, and it's really on the left and the right. I mean, for obvious reasons. I mean, what politicians want to come out and say, well, I'm against the family, I hate the family, down with the family, right? It's hard to be against the family. And so it makes sense that a moral slogan like family values would have such a significant influence in shaping at least the language of our politics, if not the actual politics themselves. So in that sense, the Christian counterculture and the religious right have been unifying factors in American life. And that's ultimately what they proposed to be since the 1970s, right? They wanted to resolve America's crisis of leadership by providing leadership themselves, supporting new right politicians to bring America back to God, and to unify the country around Judeo-Christian values. So the religious right itself would see itself as a unifying force in American life. Have they been? Well, you can see kind of the picture of what is meant by family when groups like Moral Majority or Christian Coalition, Family Research Council, when they talk about family values, what exactly do they mean? Well, they mean mom, dad, and whatever kids mom and dad produces. That is a really narrow understanding of the family unit, especially if you are looking at what constitutes families in America today. Well, what constitutes a family in the United States today is very, very diverse from that for a lot of different reasons. Single-parent households, divorce, gay marriage, so same-sex marriage, that do not exactly fit that particular definition. Now, the religious right would say, as they are sometimes talked about in UN circles, well, we are just advocating for the natural family. That mom, dad, and whatever kids they produce. This is the natural family. And I'll leave it to you guys to debate amongst yourselves. How natural is the nuclear family that captured the evangelical imagination in the 70s and 80s? How natural is that in America today and on a world scale? But one thing I think we absolutely can say is, for as much as the language of family has been a unifying force since the 1980s, the way that people have gone about defining family or thinking that family needs to be redefined has been a significant source of contention in America. So as much as we might think that as much as Christians have tried to be a unifying force in American culture, they have in many ways added to the divisions too, by in some ways leaving out single parents, not really able to stem the tide of divorce all that much, and their opinions on same-sex marriage have been divisive as much as they've been unifying too. Another slogan that maybe you haven't heard this one because it quickly faded from the scene, just say no. Just say no was the slogan for Nancy Reagan's 1987 anti-drug campaign. Just say no to drugs. Just say no seemed to be a good strategy for the new right and for religious conservatives for obvious reasons. For Christians, just say no. Just say no to drugs. That could be expanded out to just say no to sex outside of marriage. Just say no to alcohol abuse. Just say no, drug abuse. Just say no, just say no, just say no. It makes a lot of sense if you're a Christian, a Bible reading Christian, right? Because you read Paul's letters, for instance, and you see a lot of emphasis on people being self-controlled, right? So there's a real sense in which a just say no strategy to problems like alcohol and teen sex and drugs is biblical, right? So you understand why Christians would support that. I can understand why New Right politicians would support that too, right? New Right politicians are all about believing government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. Nancy Reagan's Just Say No to Drugs was a call for Americans to take personal responsibility. It's up to you to say no to drug abuse or drug use or drug abuse. It's up to you to say no to alcohol abuse. It's up to you, kids, to say no to teen sex. And so there's that emphasis on personal responsibility, which was key to the conservative movement. But understand too how that served the less is more, philosophy, right? Under a just say no political regime, if you will, the responsibility for good behavior really lies in the individual. So what if the individual being told just say no to drugs, what if the individual says yes to drugs? Well, that's that person's fault. Who's responsible? Ultimately that person. Who's not responsible? The government. So what role does the government have to play in drug abuse, in alcohol abuse, in teen sex rates? Under a just say no regime, none. In many ways, critics of conservatism kind of lambasted the Just Say No campaign as trying to do this particular thing, trying to dismantle the welfare state under the idea that government doesn't have a responsibility to create social conditions which makes it less likely that people would engage in alcohol abuse, drug abuse, and teen sex. So as quickly as Just Say No emerged on the scene, it was in many ways laughed out of existence. But it didn't go away. It just the the words behind the words, Just Say No, that phrase went away. But the idea that individuals are responsible for they're responsible to say no to all these things that will harm them. This didn't go away. It just became different things. I don't know if any of you saw like public service announcements in the 2000s, the Above the Influence campaign. Some of you probably have other examples of this kind of Just Say No. They don't say Just Say No anymore, but kind of these public service announcements, particularly directed at young people that are trying to encourage young people to take responsibility for themselves and not expect, not expect help from the government or some other place. And so what I'm saying is just like with the family values, the Just Say No campaign, even though that quickly went away and the phrase quickly went away, Christians in pushing that idea of taking personal responsibility for these social problems like alcohol abuse, drug abuse, teen sex, they just kind of they have proliferated since the 1980s. Even though we don't say Just Say No, in many ways that philosophy has been central to how we've dealt with multiple problems. And is that a bad thing? Well, since the 1980s, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, teen sex rates, all these things, I mean, they ebb and flow, but the general trajectory since the Just Say No years has been that these are less of a problem in America. It turns out that encouraging people, and particularly youth, to just say no or to take personal responsibility for their actions it works. It's a good thing. So I don't want to completely write this particular philosophy off. It seems to have had borne a lot of good fruit in solving some of our problems, but we do have to ask, to what extent does a Just Say No message of personal responsibility, to what extent does that simplify some otherwise complex problems? To what extent does a Just Say No approach to social problems, particularly youth problems, to what extent does that ignore all the different forces in a person's life, or all the different forces in a young person's life that's encouraging them to say yes? How strong are we? How able are persons to rise above the environments that they are in? How much are we creatures of our environments? How much knowledge do we really have to be able to make the right decisions, versus how much are we just torn by other kinds of forces that lead us to make decisions we don't necessarily know are good or bad? In other words, to what extent does a Just Say No message of personal responsibility, to what extent does it simplify complex problems? Particularly, to what extent does it leave, to what extent does it obscure the ways in which government should be taking more responsibility for resolving particular issues, and a Just Say No philosophy kind of gives them cover. To kind of illustrate that, I want to talk to you a little bit about the history of AIDS in the United States. AIDS was first reported on by predominantly gay journalists, because it was arising in gay communities in the United States in the late 1970s. And people didn't quite know what this thing is. It's not unlike what's been going on with the coronavirus currently. People were wondering what was this thing that was affecting increasingly large numbers of Americans. Although this disease seemed to be concentrated particularly among homosexuals and homosexual communities. In fact, AIDS wasn't called AIDS, AIDS autoimmune deficiency syndrome. AIDS wasn't called AIDS at first, it was called GRIDS, gay-related immune deficiency syndrome, because it was seen as a problem that particularly afflicted gay people. And the Christian community in the United States responded to AIDS/GRIDS in a very predictable kind of way. Jerry Falwell was fairly outspoken in the early 1980s in saying AIDS was a judgment of God on homosexuals, because the belief was that AIDS was something that only afflicted homosexuals. Billy Graham himself, when asked this question, is AIDS a judgment of God? And Graham said, is AIDS a judgment of God on homosexuals? I think so. Even Graham, a venerable new evangelical, kind of went down this road of saying that AIDS is a particular problem for the homosexual community. This made it more unlikely that Republicans like Ronald Reagan, who were trying to court the support of people like Jerry Falwell and Billy Graham, that they would want to really take up this particular issue. So through the early 1980s, all kinds of people. It started as gay journalists, but eventually it's doctors and public health officials who are dealing with this particular issue of AIDS. And understand, nobody really understood anything about what this was, how it was contracted, how it was. They just didn't know much about it. The thought was this is something that isn't just a problem for homosexuals, but nobody had really done the research to know what to do. And the Reagan administration really didn't want to deal with this particular issue until 1985, when the actor Rock Hudson, gay actor Rock Hudson, died of AIDS. Not only was Rock Hudson a friend of Ronald Reagan, but he was well known to Americans, and so when Hudson died of AIDS, suddenly the country is asking, AIDS? What's that? And at this point, Reagan goes to his Surgeon General, C. Everett Koop, says, Koop, I need you to find out everything you can about AIDS. Stop everything you're doing. Find out about what's going on here. You might remember C. Everett Koop. He had traveled around the country with Francis Schaeffer, promoting the pro-life cause. C. Everett Koop was a member of the religious right. I don't know whether he believed AIDS was the judgment of God on homosexuals or not, but he clearly was not a fan of gay rights. He had more limited definition. He was a family values kind of conservative, of why Reagan chose him to court the support of the religious right, particularly around the abortion issue. So Koop for 2 years uses the power of the federal government to investigate AIDS, to do all kinds of research, figure out what's going on. In 1987, the first Surgeon General's report on AIDS is released. Pretty much everything we know about AIDS today was uncovered by Koop in that 1987 report. And one of the glaring things about it is recognition that AIDS is not a particular problem just for homosexuals, that AIDS is a deadly virus that can spread throughout an entire population. I don't have exact numbers, but we're talking about thousands, tens of thousands of Americans who are infected and dying of AIDS in the 1980s. By the time that this Surgeon General's report comes out. Even after that, actual practices. My wife was a nurse. She she would in the early 1990s, she would tell me that even in the early 1990s they were like quarantining AIDS patients. They weren't sure if AIDS was something that could be transmitted virally. Of course, it can. It's transmitted through the blood. That's in the Surgeon General's report, but still, Americans, even in the early to mid 90s, were still trying to figure out exactly how to handle the AIDS situation. Koop made himself persona non grata among the religious right by suggesting that AIDS was not a problem for the homosexual community in the United States, that it was a public health crisis, that is something that could be spread in a variety of different ways. And they needed to take a to a public health crisis, they needed to take a comprehensive approach to it. Koop recommended increased sex education programs. Religious right was not necessarily opposed to that, but the religious right believed in abstinence-only sex education programs. The only solution to issues of teen pregnancy and sexually transmitted disease and what have you was to not have sex outside of marriage. Koop takes the unprecedented steps of recommending that schools need to teach the use of condoms. It's not that Koop himself believed that teens should be having sex. He just was realistic in saying, look, this is I have my values on one side, but I'm also responsible for, the public health of the United States on the other side, and we can't just expect everyone, particularly young people, to not have sex. They're going to have sex, and when they do, we need to make sure that they're being safe, because we don't want to transmit AIDS throughout the entire country. So Reagan announces in 1987 that Koop's report is out. He holds a press conference on the issue. He's not really answering questions about it. As he's walking back to Air Force One, he's being hounded by reporters who are asking him, questions about the Surgeon General's report about AIDS and what have you. Reagan is not responding to any of these questions. Reagan gets to the top of the plane. His last parting words on the Surgeon General's report, before he gets in the plane, well, you can guess what those words were. Reagan says, just say no. Koop would discover that Reagan had not even read the report. Just say no. You don't want to get AIDS? Just say no to gay sex, and you'll be fine. Of course, that's not the reality of AIDS, is it? It was a public health crisis because of the slow response by the Reagan administration, because of the religious right's turning on C. Everett Koop and refusal to listen to what he's saying there. AIDS continued to spread in the United States. It continued to spread around the world. The Bush, kind of in a replay of the C. Everett Koop situation. The George W. Bush administration. Bush is good evangelical, but was realistic about, look, people are going to have sex, whether we think that they should in a particular circumstance or not, and so we need to be realistic. The Bush administration in the 2000s developed the ABC sex education program, particularly to combat AIDS in Africa, where it's just spreading. AIDS has been devastating to that continent, right? ABC, abstinence, be faithful, use condoms. Comprehensive sex education program. The religious right, beginning in the 2000s and into the present, have been trying to defund those programs or to get them to cut off the be faithful and use condoms. They've been trying to promote only an A sex education program, teaching abstinence only. Under the just say no strategy, right? Abstinence only sex education programs go very well with a just say no kind of strategy. But again, we have to ask ourselves, what are the how easy is it, I guess, for people to say no to things like alcohol, drugs, and sex? To what extent does a just say no approach to these particular issues simplify more complex realities? To what extent do we need comprehensive solutions to problems that are of a more comprehensive nature? Right, we're still in many ways struggling with these issues today. So again, I'll kind of end where, in some ways, I began this lecture with, as you think about being a Christian engaged in the contemporary world, the kind of things that you have learned about in this series of lectures. How do you want to go about making a difference in the world? Is it through Christian haunted houses and through Christian cultural products? Is it through promotion of slogans like family values and just say no? Are these enough, or do Christians need to move in different directions? These aren't answers that I will, I'm not going to try to answer those particular kinds of questions. I feel like I need to give you guys the questions, and you can come up with the answers. But I do encourage you to reflect on knowing how Christians have and are making a difference in the world today through their political activity, through their cultural activity. How do you want to make a difference in the world? Since you're at a place like Spring Arbor, most of you have, whether you've heard the name Francis Schaeffer before, you've already you've already kind of answered that question, right? And most of you are not going to leave Spring Arbor to join an Amish community or a monastery, right? You want to go out, you want to try to spread the Lordship of Christ in your particular professions, whether it's social work or nursing or business or law or wherever you're going to end up. But the question is politically, culturally, how are you going to be that critical participant in the contemporary world? So I leave that for you to consider. And I wanted to, I've been struggling over the last couple of days how I wanted to try to kind of wrap up this lecture. I've been thinking a lot about this issue of conflicts in America. And in some ways, I think that the central conflicts in America today resolve around the struggle between the exercise of our personal liberty and the restraints that are put on that, right? Kind of a classical liberal position as espoused here by the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen from the French Revolution of 1789. But if you read somebody like John Stuart Mill from the 1840s, they would say that personal liberty should be as unbounded as it possibly can be. The only thing that really should limit freedom is when your freedom does harm to somebody else. This sometimes philosophers call this the harm principle. Reflect on this statement. There's a lot of ambiguities here. All right, so you can do whatever you want as long as it doesn't harm somebody else. It's easy to say that, but what exactly constitutes harm to somebody else? I mean, we are currently in this particular coronavirus crisis. We are knee deep in this 1789 statement right now. I should have the freedom to go walk around Walmart. Well, what if you're walking around Walmart means that you touch a bag of seeds and you didn't know you had COVID-19 because you're asymptomatic? You touch that and you put some of the virus on that bag of seeds, and you're fine. But grandma right behind you ends up picking up that bag of seeds, and grandma ends up contracting COVID-19 and dies. in that hypothetical, should your freedom be limited to touch that bag of seeds by kind of coordinating, that off? This gets at, in other words, I'm getting at kind of the ambiguities here of, of the harm principle. Well, what kinds of limits should be put on individual behavior? Because it seems like almost anything we could do could bring harm to somebody else. In particular, who should be responsible for limiting the freedoms of individuals? To what authority does the state have to do that? To what authority does the state have to say, look, for this month you can't go touch those bag of seeds at least in this particular store, right? You can go get seeds some other place, but in this particular store you can't go get seeds because we're all the different reasons we're trying to limit the reasons people might want to leave their homes and go out in the public and potentially spread or contract COVID-19. Who should be responsible for putting limits on freedom? So it's not just the question of what limits should be put on individual freedom, but also who should be doing the limiting. So we're knee deep in some pretty serious conflicts in America. And in many ways, these are conflicts that have shaped American history from the start. The struggle between individual liberty and public safety, or the so-called common good, right? It's nice when those two things go together. It's nice when the common good is best expressed through a maximization of personal liberty, but we know that that's not always the case. Sometimes personal liberties need to be circumscribed for the common good. We've been especially making more of those kinds of decisions since the New Deal era, right? We put limits on people's freedom of their paychecks, right? The government mandates that a certain part of your paycheck goes out to pay for Social Security, pay for elderly insurance, unemployment insurance, with the understanding that when you eventually become unemployed or elderly in the future, you will also have this money available for you as well too. That's a constraint that's placed on individual freedom out of a belief in the common good or public safety. These are, these are things that exist in tension with each other. My encouragement to you would be twofold. One, pick a side. All right? Figure out which side you're on the common good versus the personal liberty, and know why you're there. Okay? Sometimes people like to say that the problem with America today is the party system. The problem is Democrats and Republicans fighting with each other. I tend to think that the biggest problem in America are independents. Yes, it's true that there are some independents out there that are independents because because they've it's an informed position. But I think a lot of cases the independent position is one that is there because students, is there because people don't want to really educate themselves on these foundational principles of American society. They don't want to choose. For whatever reasons, because it's late, because they're lazy, because it's hard, whatever, and so they end up being easily manipulated in all kinds of ways. My problems that I encounter with students on these issues are not so much the conservative students or the liberal students. The more outspoken conservative, the more outspoken liberal students, I tend to appreciate both of them the best because at least they've informed themselves and they know where they stand. We might not, always agree. Sometimes I disagree with the more outspoken conservatives. Sometimes I disagree with the more outspoken liberals. Right? That's my role as a teacher, is to try to, stand in the middle and play devil's advocate. But I do appreciate them because they are people who have studied the sides and chosen a side. The problem I have are the students who just don't know, just have no idea what they believe, and so really have no ability to even kind of choose a side because they haven't thought through these kinds of issues. And those are the most frustrating situations for me. So my encouragement would be for you is to pick a side. If you're going to be an independent, if you want to try to stand in the middle or be a third way or try to be neutral in the culture wars or whatever, that's fine. But do so from a standpoint of education and not from a standpoint of ignorance, not from a standpoint of thinking that somehow apathy is a political virtue. Know why you believe what you believe. The second encouragement is to understand that in many ways America works best when there is a tension between personal liberty and the common good. And we can find ways to civilly work through these differences. Now, I realize that we're in a present in which we're not entirely sure that we can work through our differences in a peaceful kind of way. And it's I want to admit it's a dangerous time to be an American. I'm scared for our present. I'm scared for our future. Because I don't know how committed everyone is in this country to working through this tension between liberty and the common good. I'm not sure how committed everyone is to working through these differences in a peaceful and rational kind of way. My encouragement to you is to pick a side, but also be committed to working through these differences in a peaceful and rational kind of way. Rather than adopting what one of my colleagues rightly calls the team jersey mentality of my side's the best and everyone else sucks. Pick a side, defend your side, passionately defend your side, but recognize that we all, as Americans, have a right to different opinions. And we will be strong as we work through our differences, not through trying to shout down or destroy differences altogether, right? There are societies out there in the world today that don't have the kinds of culture wars and conflicts over political values, conflicts between identity groups and what have you. There's societies out there that don't have these kinds of conflicts. One, for instance, is North Korea. You guys want to go live in North Korea? Yeah, probably not. And so, absent wanting to live in a totalitarian society without individual freedom, the price of individual freedom is social conflict. And we have to be committed to working through that. So my encouragement to you is to pick a side, but also to work with the other side towards compromise and peaceful resolutions. And I appreciate you guys hanging with me for these 2 hours and 40 minutes of lecture. Still shorter than what I would do normally in-class lectures, about 20 minutes shorter. But I do appreciate you guys hanging with me. And if you would like to talk through these issues further, understand just because the course ends doesn't mean that I stop being an instructor and a friend. We can continue to work through these issues for a long, long time. All right. God bless you guys.